Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Translating Strategy into Performance Management with Technology here on Amoge Radio Communications, this beautiful second Monday of September 2025, Monday, September 8th. Have you been? Hope you had a restful weekend and we are glad to have you on our platform again, Amoge Radio Communications. Thank you so much for being with us. Today you are in for another exciting, engaging, educative, enlightening, and hopefully empowering episode, right? Today we are going to go deeper into the comparisons we've been making between the Amogate strategy PIMA cycle and the Amogate performance management PIMA cycle, right? The Amogate strategy PIMA cycle and the Amogate performance management PIMA cycle. For those who've been joining us, you know what that means. If you have not been joining us, well, we are happy to share what those mean with you again. Remember, the theme for this program, this quarter-long theme, has been translating strategy into performance management with technology. So the Amogate strategy cycle is PIMA, P standing for planning, I standing for implementation, M representing monitoring, E representing evaluation, and R standing for revision. I'll say that again. The Amogate strategic management PIMA cycle has the P standing for planning, that's strategic planning, I representing implementation, that's implementation of the strategic plan, M standing for monitoring, E for evaluation, and R for revision, that's strategy revision after you have done the evaluation. Meanwhile, the performance management cycle is represented by PIMA, where you have P standing for planning/contracting, that's performance goals, planning, and contracting. E stands for execution, that's the execution of the performance goals. M represents monitoring, where you also coach, that's monitoring of the performance goals set and coaching in accordance. R stands for assessment, right? That's assessment of the performance goals agreed upon, contracted. And finally, R represents rewards and consequences. So, we've been looking at connecting strategy with or translating strategy into performance management, and we spent the last 4 to 5 weeks establishing why it is important to do this, in a corresponding manner, in a synchronized manner, because the whole reason why you translate strategy into performance management is to ensure that you're bridging the strategy performance gap. I'll say that again. The essence, the criticality of translating strategy into performance management is to guarantee or to minimize, either to guarantee the implementation of strategy or to minimize the chances of having a gap between strategy and execution, which happens a lot. There's typically a huge gap in organizations between the strategy and strategic goal set and actual implementation. However, to minimize the chances of that occurrence, right, to minimize the chances of the non-implementation of strategy or the non-execution of strategic goals, you can connect strategy with performance management. You can ensure that you translate the strategic goals set at the organizational level into performance goals at the lower levels of the organization, at all levels of the organizational hierarchy, right? And you can also use technology to enable this. This has been the essence of this program, and we've been on this for the last 8 weeks, this being the 9th episode of the program. And this must be done methodically. This must be done, incrementally. This must be done holistically, right? To do this as comprehensively as possible, we have to ensure that each part of the strategic management cycle is connected with the corresponding portion of the performance management cycle. We're going to say that again. To ensure that this is done exhaustively, to ensure that no part of the process is missed, right? You have to do your best as an organization to connect every part of the strategic management cycle with the corresponding elements in the performance management cycle, using technology to facilitate the process, to enable the process, to bring efficiency to the process, and so on and so forth, right? So that's what we've been on in the last 4 to 5 weeks, connecting the strategic management cycle with the performance management cycle to guarantee a thorough and comprehensive translation of strategy into performance management using technology. Now, we're going to take a quick highlight of some of the things we talked about last week, and then we'll go into the breadth and depth of today. But before we do that, don't forget that the the different parts of the cycles have been connected in previous programs, right? And today we are now going to connect the last part of the cycle. We have spent the last 4 to 5 weeks connecting the planning of the strategy to the planning of the performance goals, across all levels of the organization. A whole episode was dedicated to that. Please check this episode out on Amogate Radio Communications. Please join our YouTube page. We have a whole bank and wealth of information on diverse issues, from geopolitics to sports and lessons and management lessons, to roadmaps, organizational strategy, to fiscal lessons, fiscal inclusion and economic growth. I mean, there's a whole vast bank and array of information and knowledge and insights that have come from a depth and wealth of experience across nations, regions, and continents. So believe me, there's a whole lot available for you. Please subscribe to Amogate Radio Communications and, feed off, glean from, learn from the abundance of information, knowledge, and insights on our ARC page, Amogate Radio Communications. Specifically for this quarter, you will also find these previous episodes of the program. So I'm not going to go deeply into some of the things we have shared before. Please go and check them out. But I'm going to allude to some of them. Now, so we've spent some 4 to 5 weeks looking at the different parts, and we're coming to the final part. We've talked about connecting strategic planning to performance goals planning and contracting. We've talked about connecting the implementation of the strategy to the execution of performance management goals, which was what we focused on last week, and I'm going to talk about a few highlights from that. We've also connected, the monitoring of the strategic plan to the monitoring of the performance management goals set for different levels of the organizational strategy, of the organizational structure, as well as coaching in the process. So we've connected the M to the M, the monitoring to the monitoring. We have likewise shown how to connect the evaluation of the organizational strategy with the assessment of the performance goal. And finally, we come to the last part today, the R on both sides. Today, we are going to talk about, how to connect the revision of the organizational strategy with rewards and consequences that should follow performance evaluation. I'm going to say that again. Today, we are going to talk about how to connect the revision of the organizational strategy after the evaluation of the organizational strategy with the rewards and consequences in the performance management cycle, which should come after the evaluation. Let me say one or two things with it. The reason why you conduct strategy evaluation, we've said this before, is to see what's working, to see what's not working, to see why what is working, right? Because sometimes when you read the literature, when you read the research indicates that it's not just about gathering the performance management information, but it's about translating performance management information into strategic decision making. I'm going to say that again. Many times the research has indicated that part of the challenges is that even when the performance management information or the strategy evaluation information is gathered, what happens is that the changes that should be made, right, at the level of the decision making, strategic decision making, do not follow post-evaluation. What then is the essence of evaluation if it's not going to inform strategic revision? Like I said, we devoted a whole episode to connecting the evaluation of the organizational strategy with the assessment of performance management goals. Please go and check that out. We spoke a lot to that. Today, we are more interested in talking about how to do the strategic revision and also connect the revision of the organizational strategy with the what and consequences that should follow performance evaluation at the level of different roles and different different hierarchical heights, so to say, in the organizational structure. Welcome again to Translating Strategy to Performance Management and Amogate Radio Communications. My name remains Tolu Modara. This beautiful Monday, September 8th, 2025, on episode 9 of Translating Strategy to Performance Management with Technology. So let's quickly do a quick recap. Like I said, it's going to be quicker than some of the ones you've been used to. For the sake of time, please go and check out the previous episodes on our Amogate Radio Communications. So it's going to be just a very quick recap of some of the highlights of last week, and then we go into the depth of today's episode. So last week we looked at connecting strategy implementation with performance goals execution using technology. I repeat, connecting strategy implementation with performance goals execution using technology. In other words, how do you ensure that you are the goals, the performance goals that have been set are executed in a manner that is in tandem with the implementation of the strategy as the mentioned. Well, one of the things that should have been clear from these past 8 episodes is that strategy is often done at the organizational level. In fact, sometimes even at the group level, right? And the organizations within the group have to feed off the strategy at the group level. So strategy is done at the highest level of the organization possible, but implementation happens at lower levels of the organization. In fact, some like to call those lower levels operational levels. I don't like to use the word operational because they are still supposed to bring strategic clarity, strategic focus, strategic discrimination, and so many other things should be happening at those lower levels. So I don't like to call them operational levels of the organization, but one thing is clear, they are definitely at the lower levels of the organization than the level at which strategy is done. So no doubt about it, strategy happens at the highest levels possible, and implementation happens at the lower levels of the organization. However, if strategy is not going to end up on the shelf, if strategy is not going to remain in the document, if strategy is not going to be simply for the sake of strategizing or simply for the sake of strategic planning, if a planning is actually going to be translated into implementation, into outputs, into outcomes, right? Then you must ensure, the organization must ensure that there is that connection between strategy and performance management. Performance management is the tool, is a system, is a mechanism through which you ensure that you either minimize or obliterate the gap between strategy and implementation. I'll say that again. Performance management is the tool, is a mechanism, right, through which you ensure that you either minimize or obliterate the gap between the strategic goal set and those that would actually be implemented, right? So when it comes to making those connections, like we said last week, once you have identified your strategic direction, your strategic priorities, your strategic themes, and strategic objectives as an organization, right, it becomes easier for you to connect the performance goals and priorities of the different units of the organization with those strategic priorities that have been identified at the organization. I need to say something here. It's very easy for you to assume that these things are defined, but you would be surprised if you're not careful that what you have is a lot of documentation, yet minimal strategic clarity. I'll say that again from our experience, and we've been doing this for the last 17 years as an organization, close to 2 decades of doing this as an organization. You would be surprised that many times you have a lot of documentation, but there's no strategic clarity. If you speak to anyone in the organization and you say, what is the one thing that the organization is focused on in the next 3 to 5 years, you will be surprised. You could have a cacophony of voices. You could have a litany of responses. You could have very disjointed perspectives. And that is why many times strategy does not get implemented, because there is a lack of strategic clarity. There's so much bogus implementation, but very little strategic clarity as to the exact direction in which the organization is headed. Again, I'm not going to repeat all the things that we've said, but please remember that for you to be able to, implement organizational strategy through the implementation of the organizational of performance goals, at the lower levels of the organization, for you to be able to execute the strategy set at the higher level of the organization through the implementation of the performance goals set at lower levels of the organization, there must be strategic direction, strategic priorities, strategic themes, and strategic objectives. All of those things must have been clearly defined, underlined, and italicize that word clearly. With that strategic clarity, it becomes easier to ensure that the goals of the different levels, the performance goals or different levels of the organization, are feeding into the overall strategic goals that they should be supporting. In other words, one particular strategic goal should be cascaded, like they say into performance management, into different performance goals for different levels of the organization. And when that clarity happens, 4 key things can follow, like we said last week. There'll be 4 key elements that should be connected to ensure a seamless synchronization between the implementation of the organizational strategy and the execution of performance goals. 1, policy, right? Policy, like we said, is like the framework or structure which should support the strategy, because strategy is what dictates the structure, which includes policy, the policy framework. Structure does not dictate strategy, right? Once that strategy clarity is there, then you can ensure that the policy is there to enable implementation at the lower levels of the organization. And I gave a simple example last week. I said if you are trying to transit, for instance, to a less human dependent a system in your organization, you want to reduce your human dependency from, for instance, 70% to, let's say, 50%, right? So right now you have 70% dependency on humans and 30% dependency on machines and systems and technology, and you want to reduce that because you have a lot of repeatable tasks in the organization, routine repeatable tasks. If you want to reduce it to 50-50 to become efficient with cost and to become more, lean, agile, responsive, and so on and so forth, you cannot then have a policy that is still geared towards, ensuring that you are, for instance, recruiting more. We talked about budgets being another element that should be connected. We give you using the example of budget. We said the budget must also be synchronized, and tech can be used to set targets and percentages, right? Figures and percentage targets. For instance, if you want to reduce that dependency, like I just said, from 70-30 to 50-50, you cannot still be having the same recruitment budget that you had in previous cycles, in previous strategic management cycles, where you were having a 70-30 dependency on leading more towards humans. You cannot run the same recruitment budget you've around there in the new strategic management cycle where you have already set a goal to reduce the dependency to 50, and so many other examples. So there are 4 key elements that should be connected: policy, process, budget, and schedule. All of these must be synchronized to ensure that, yes, you are perfectly aligned and your performance management goals at lower levels of the organization are feeding into the strategic goals set at the higher levels of the organization. Wow. I think this is how far we can go with the recap so that we can launch into the business of today. Again, thank you so much for being with us on this edition of the program. My name is Mr. Lomada on Amogate Radio Communications on this beautiful Monday where we are looking at translating strategy into performance management with technology. And today, like I said, we are looking at the last element of the PMA and PMA cycle, the R, right? Today, we are not talking about connecting planning with planning. We've done that. We're not talking about connecting implementation with execution. We've done that. We're not talking about connecting monitor with strategy. We monitor performance management goals, implementation. We've done that. Neither we're talking about monitoring the evaluation of the organizational strategy with connecting that with monitoring the assessment of performance goals, because we've done that. Today we are talking about connecting the revision of the organizational strategy with the rewards and consequences that should follow performance evaluation. I repeat, today we are looking at connecting the revision of the organizational strategy that should follow the evaluation of the organizational strategy with the rewards and consequences that should follow the evaluation of performance goals. Now let's talk a little bit about rewards and consequences.
Harmogate, founded in 2008 out of a desire to build transgenerational structures for organizations, institutions, and nations. We have worked with large businesses, international development organizations, and public sector ministries and agencies. Harmogate, our uniqueness is that we do not just work for you, we work with you. For example, we do not leave you to the task after sourcing talent that will help the new hire settle into robust leadership development programs. We are technical experts in advising and supporting institutions on strategy and leadership, artificial intelligence, strategic human resource management, public sector reform, finance, audit and tax, FAT, and strategic communications. We do all this and more out of a desire to transform nations through institutions and organizations. For further inquiries, email contact@thearmogate.org or call +234 810 999 6666, +234 807 957 4151, and +161 0504 6026. www.thearmogate.org. Armogate, building to endure and transforming nations through institutions and organizations.
That I need to speak a little bit to rewards and consequences management, right? Strategy revision, we've talked a little bit. incrementally in different episodes of this program. But rewards and consequences is the part I think we haven't really spoken to, right? As much as strategy revision. Strategy revision, like I said, has to do with evaluating. After evaluating the strategy, you essentially say what's working. So you're basically looking at what is working, why is it working, what is not working, why is it not working, in what regions are what is working, in what departments is it working, and so on and so forth. So you go very methodically and you do a comprehensive strategy revision, right? When it comes to rewards and consequences, though, let me speak a little bit to that. It's not necessarily about revising the goals. So you're not just taking, you've already done your performance assessment, right? Remember, we said monitoring can be more ongoing, and performance assessment or performance evaluation is more, end of term, right? Like at the end of a 3-month period, if it's a quarterly performance cycle, at the end of a 6-month period, if that's it, or at the end of a year, if it's an annual one, it shouldn't be more than a year, so that you have consistent focus. And as for lower levels of the organization, it should be quarterly. Now, when you do that evaluation, a performance management cycle is not complete without rewards and consequences. Please take note. You see, it's extremely important that you link performance with rewards. And rewards here are both financial and non-financial rewards. It's important because implementation happens at the level of performance goals. And so you want to ensure that you are tying performance with rewards in order to encourage the behaviors you want to perpetuate. Rewards are one of the most powerful tools for shaping organizational behavior. I'm going to say that again. Rewards and consequences management, because it's both ways, are one of the most powerful tools of shaping organizational behavior. And many times, I don't know if you've heard it said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that was attributed to Peter Drucker. So you can have the most strategic plan in place, the most beautiful, well-articulated, excellently coordinated, even well-communicated strategic plan in place. And if the behavior of the employees of the organization is in discordance with the heart of that strategic plan, implementation may still be dead on arrival. So when you do your performance planning and you follow up with the execution, you do your monitoring, and you do the performance assessment, if rewards and consequences do not follow, what you're basically saying to people is that they don't have to revise their behavior. And that's why for us in the PMA cycle, it was important to not just say, at the strategic level, you could say strategy revision, right, at the organizational level, because usually there's a higher level of responsibility and ownership and accountability at the senior levels. You can look at the strategy and say what's working and not working and do that. But at the performance management level, at the lower levels of the organization, that assessment, if you do not tie it with rewards and consequences, the chances are high that those who are doing well, one, may be discouraged because you don't have the courage as an organization to differentiate behavior. Take note. You don't have the courage as a manager, perhaps, to differentiate performance. And so if you give blanket rewards, we've seen that a lot in the course of consulting over the last 17 years. We've seen organizations still give everybody bonuses that are equal, especially in some parts of the world as opposed to other parts. And what that does is that, one, it discourages the top performers. It discourages those whose behaviors and efforts and outputs are likely to drive the implementation of the strategic goals. And of course, it's sending the wrong message to those who are either performing poorly, or those who have the wrong attitude, or those who are not giving in their best, those who are not meeting the minimum performance goals. It's sending the wrong message to them that their poor performance is permissible. Very, very dangerous. Once that happens, even if you revisit your strategy and you revise your strategy, those behaviors or poor performances that are left unchecked will ultimately frustrate the new strategy. Because normally when you revise your strategy, you're basically coming up with some kind of newer version of the existing strategy. Even if it's not a completely new strategy, you have taken the feedback from strategy evaluation, you have used it to update the existing strategy or modify it depending on the extent of change required, and sometimes maybe completely reinvent the strategy, right? Again, depending on what level, like I said, sometimes you're evaluating at the end of a year, sometimes you're also evaluating at the end of a 3-year period, or sometimes something significant has happened like COVID, and even though you're in the middle of a strategic period, you have to, or a strategy cycle, you have to do some fundamental re-evaluations. Whatever phase you are in, right? The strategy revision will just be dead on arrival, like strategy at the beginning, if there is no corresponding rewards and consequences, right? At the beginning, when you set the strategic plan in place and you translate it to the performance plans, you are still on course. When you're implementing your strategy and you're ensuring that there's a corresponding alignment, or there's an alignment of their corresponding actions, based on the performance goal set, we are still on course because the two cars are still moving. Imagine a horse driving a cart. The two car and the horse is in front, and there are two carts simultaneously pulling. They are still going well. You are monitoring the organizational strategy or the implementation of the organizational strategy, and you're ensuring that different managers at different levels of the organization are equally and simultaneously monitoring the implementation of the performance goal set. You are still on course. You now do the evaluation at the end of the period. And you then remember, evaluation is often more end term. You have given the midterm feedback during monitoring, right? So here we're not talking about not having empathy. In one of the I remember in one of the things we posted on our Amogate pages, we said inclusive leadership and decisive leadership is not a case of or but and. So inclusiveness in leadership does not excuse lack of decisiveness. And neither does decisiveness mean she should not be inclusive. So remember here, there is the room for letting employees grow. There is room for giving them the space to make creative mistakes. There is space for allowing constructive errors in the course of implementing, especially in the spirit of ambidexterity. Ambidexterity there meaning using your other hand and your typical hand. In other words, there will be some things that they have perfected, and there will be some things that they are just learning. When they are doing the things they're just learning, there should be room because there's a balance to it. However, if they have perfected certain things and is a function of focus and attention and dedication, honestly, at that point, you have to be decisive as an organization, right? So when you're doing your strategy revision, I'm more or less saying that sometimes revising the strategy, now we're talking about making the connection. Sometimes revising the strategy requires, one, taking some people completely out of certain roles because you have already looked at the strategy sometimes and you say, you know what, it's not so much about the strategy, but about who is implementing it. Sometimes you do the strategy evaluation, like we said in previous episodes, and you see what's working. And you find out that in certain parts of the organization, the same strategy is working well. And in a similar structure, or in a similar department with the same resources, the same strategy that is working is not working, not necessarily because of something that is wrong with the strategy articulation, but something that is wrong with the strategy implementation, which sometimes even is from those who are implementing. So it's not the what, but the who. So once you can see that it's not so much about the what, but about the who, then you have to ensure that there is an alignment between what you are rewarding and the parts of the strategy that you are revising. I need to say that again. You have to ensure that there is an alignment between what you are rewarding and the parts of the strategy that you are revising. Similarly, with when I say rewards, remember, it's both ways. When people also perform, that's why I talked about having the courage to differentiate rewards. When people or certain departments or certain units are, not just meeting the goals that are driving the implementation of the strategy, that are critical to certain strategic goals, if they're not just meeting those targets but exceeding those targets, then they should be rewarded commensurately, and they should also be rewarded visibly. I need to draw that, and this is part of where technology comes in. They should be rewarded visibly because you do not want culture to eat strategy for breakfast, right? Like Peter Drucker would say, the best strategy will be eaten up with the wrong culture. Remember, rewards and consequence management is one of the most powerful tools for shaping culture. And if you really want to shape that culture through rewards, especially in large organizations, you also want to ensure that you're bringing visibility to the rewards and consequence management. You need to use technology to promote the behaviors that you find acceptable and let it be obvious. When I say promote, it's not enough to reward those behaviors. It must be visible to the entire organization through emails, through dashboards, through, if you want to even have a department of the quarter, if you want to have a region of the year, whatever you need to do, you must use technology to celebrate those performance. In fact, even at the individual levels, if you want to use technology to, from time to time, have people vote for the best manager, if, for instance, poor management has been a challenge and you have already identified it as a challenge at the strategic level, you have already said, okay, we are going to revise our strategy and ensure that there is more inclusive and decisive management. We want managers who are both inclusive and decisive. We don't want leaders or managers who are overbearing to the point where we are losing employee engagement, which, by the way, I read recently is costing some economies or up to, I think, billions of dollars, right? So if, for instance, you do not want to have leaders who are, so overbearing that the employees are disengaged, they are doing just enough not to be fired, and just enough is not enough to implement strategy. You need employees who have bought into the vision, who are sold out to the vision because they are under the leadership of effective managers. If that, for instance, becomes an element of your strategy to promote employee, a management culture that is inclusive while remaining decisive, you may even ask the employees to vote. Now, this may not apply in all organizations. You have to make sure that you take what's applicable to you. But the point here is that if there's a particular part of your strategy that you are revising, you must match it with what you are rewarding at the performance management levels, and you must use technology to bring visibility to it. Very, very important. I mean, if there's a particular part of your strategy that from your strategic evaluation, you can already see that it is being challenged in a particular way, and you can see that certain things are tied to poor performance, not because they don't have the enablers, not because the people performing poorly don't have the support. You must have checked all those boxes, and bringing that balance is very important, not because they don't have the enablers, not because they don't have the support, not because they don't have the right work climate, but just because they are probably not committed, probably distracted. You also want to use consequence management to ensure that your culture remains intact. Very, very, very important. I'll give one example and we will wrap it up. I think this is a conversation we'll have to continue next week by God's grace, because it is very critical. And you see, it's the last element. You can do everything with planning, like I said, try your best with implementation, do the monitoring. After that evaluation, if you do not follow it with the appropriate consequences and rewards, you are more or less saying that evaluation is a joke. Exactly why would somebody score 9 over 10, for instance, or score a 90% performance appraisal, grade, and you're going to give the person the same reward you give somebody who gets, let's say, 50%, then you are simply saying that average is good enough and average does not deliver strategy, because strategy is usually about going where you have not gone before. That's why I talk about blue ocean. Many times, at the minimum, is ambidextrous. You are trying something. That's what we advocate for. We are very big on ambidexterity. There must be things you have done before so that you exploit your current strengths. But you must, if you're going to stay relevant on the cutting edge, in this VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, you must also be trying things you have not done before, right? And that is innovation part of it, the explorative part of it. So if you are going to ensure that, then it's important to line it up, ensure that your rewards is mirroring the strategy revision. What you are rewarding must be what you want to promote based on your strategy. And I hope I'm not sounding too complex. Let me break it down again. Once you do your strategy evaluation, there is no point to do it. There's no point there's no point the point of doing it is defeated if it's not going to lead to strategy revision. Strategy evaluation should lead to strategy revision. And when you do that strategy revision, because strategy does not implement itself, because people implement strategy, you must ensure that you are rewarding those who are in a manner that will promote the elements of the strategy that help you, or the parts that are critical, those whose performance goals are aligned with it, and whose performance goal evaluation have demonstrated their commitment to it, to your strategic plans that are critical to your growth and your responsiveness and your ability to stay relevant to the market, if the people who are contributing through their performance implementation or the implementation of their performance goals are not rewarded appropriately after the performance evaluation, we are simply saying to them that they can be discouraged, they don't have to give their best anymore, and you're also saying to those who are performing poorly that their lack of commitment to the organization is permissible. Wow. I think this is where I'm going to stop on today's edition of the program. Don't forget, this is not something we can walk through. It is where the rubber hits the road. Otherwise, every other thing you have done may be a waste. Connecting strategy revision with rewards and consequences management, right? After performance evaluation with technology is what we have been talking about, and we're going to continue with you when we come back next week and go deeper into it, because this is what guarantees that all of the evaluation is not just for the sake of evaluation, but it will actually translate into a strategy revision that will also be implemented to the point of positive, enduring, and profitable change. Thank you very, very much for staying with us on this edition of the program. It's been, very interesting and fulfilling. We've barely finished. We'll be back next week, like I said. Until then, please remember that there are other programs that come up throughout the week. And remember that we have a rich data, a rich bank, a rich wealth, a vast wealth of varied and very relevant knowledge and insights that come from close to 2 decades of doing what we do in different sectors, from the public to the private to the non-profit sectors across regions. And until I see you same time, same station next week, remember, you don't just have to think strategy revision, you must also be ready to discriminate performance through rewards and consequences. My name remains Tobo Modera. I'll see you same time, same station next week. Until then, stay safe, be good, and keep thinking strategy revision through rewards and consequences. Thank you.